spent a lot of time teaching in Australia. And I used to get visited by the double bass players. They were so sweet. They would come and find me wherever I was teaching. We're here about George and the bass, and oh my God, that's so cool. And they loved it. They use it in Australia too.
Digging deep into a topic near and dear to my heart. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations. We're chatting with a name that I know from my George Vance books for years and years, Annette Costanzi, who co-wrote these books, with George Vance back several decades ago at this point, but they're just such valuable resources. The Progressive Repertoire series is something that I use each and every day in my bass teaching, and I've just totally fallen in love with it. And we dig into that, how this method came to be, and Annette, her experiences working with George to create these books, and just a little bit about George and the special magic that surrounds this series. Really valuable conversation, and I know you're going to enjoy it. Quick shout out to our sponsors, D'Addario Strings, Upton Bass, the Bass Violin Shop, Steve Swan String Bass, and the A440 Violin Shop. More on them later in this episode, but let's dig into this conversation with Annette Costanzi.
The reason I met George was because I was supposed to meet George. That was very clear to both George and me. But it all started because in 1984, I was living in Washington, D.C., was I? Yes. And I just had a baby, and I went to, this was in spring, and I flew to France with my son, and who was 3 weeks old, and it was a very crazy trip. But Dr. Suzuki was in France for our convention, and so of course I was going to be there, and I went along, and I saw all these double bass players, and I was like, what is going on? Because there was no double bass in 1984 in Suzuki land, and it was Rodney Slatford. I don't know if you know that name, but I mean, he was a wonderful bass player. Yeah, Rodney. So Rodney, it was the same thing as, like, it reminded me of your podcast. He said, I'm sick of this. I said to him, I said, Rodney, what are you doing here? And he said, it was a monastery in the middle of nowhere in France and the countryside. And he said, I'm tired of double bass being a second-class instrument, and no children are being taught it properly, and I'm going to start, I want to have a revolution. And I said, well, good for you. So you've chosen us. And he said, well, yeah, I had to find out what you guys were doing, because you're the only ones who seem to have any interest in really small children. It was very interesting. So Rodney was very, and he had got himself funded to find 10 young, good double bass players. They were probably all his students, to come along and just join in our conference and do their own thing, but be exposed to Dr. Suzuki and all of us teacher trainers. And so, and one of them was Caroline Emory. Now, you remember, do you know her?
Oh yeah, I've actually interviewed her. Caroline's great. She's a friend.
Yeah. Okay. Right. She's a friend of mine too. Well, that's when we met, and she was one of the kids that Rodney brought, and so then, and it was wonderful, actually. And Suzuki was fascinated with it, and he loved going in there and messing around with the bass, and trying to find his magic tone, and they loved him. I mean, it was wow. Just, it was all around good. I mean, even I went in, and Rodney asked me to come in, and I said, what do I know about double bass? And he said, come and tell us what you know. So I did. I had a session with him, and it was fascinating. Anyway, then I came back, and I went to Washington, where I was unhappily living. And I didn't want to be there. And then I was hired to teach at the Catholic University, the Suzuki Institute there. Mm. So it was like the first day I was there, and I was doing a teacher training thing, and all of a sudden in walks this very intense man. And he said, hello, my name is George Vance. And I said, well, hello, George Vance. And he said, I want you to be my teacher trainer. And I said, okay, well, join the class. He said, I'm a double bass player. I said, oh, George. George, this is ironic. This is amazing. I've just come from France, and Rodney Slatford and all these double bass people. They're the ones you want to be talking with. He said, no, I want to talk with you. I said, I really think you should be talking with Rodney. So something happened there with Rodney, not a whole lot. And Rodney, of course, went off and did his own thing, and that was all great. And then Caroline went off and did her thing, and that's also great. In the meantime, George just stuck like glue. He said, no, I've been listening to you, and I want to do this with you. So I said, well, okay, why don't we just try to figure something out here? And that was just the beginning. And my God, it was astonishing. So it was. It was absolutely astonishing. And so we started to develop a method for the double bass that was based on the same principles that Suzuki method is, that I was, using, doing, helping to, make myself. And so George and I said, George, you live too far away from me. You have to move. So he moved.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, he moved. Martha, he moved. And so they were like 3 doors down from me on Lamont Street. Martha remembers that. She remembers everything, of course. And what was it? I guess, no, Martha was in there too. Was she doing teacher training with me? Anyway, she ended up doing teacher training with me too. Cello, needless to say.
Right.
But George and I started working on the idea of a bass method that was starting with tiny children and with the parents involved, and the whole basis of what we did was what I was already doing on the cello and what Suzuki had taught us. And but there was no material. And George was a genius. I mean, he said, okay, I said, let's decide what it is, what principle of technique that we're trying to develop right now. And then he would go away and come back in a few hours or the next day, and he'd have made a piece that was, yeah, I know. He was amazing about it. And then we go through it. Is this hitting the mark? Is this what we need? And we went through it pedagogically. I mean, really carefully, and starting, in the neck, in the saddle, I call it, with the harmonics and all that. And it was revolutionary, absolutely revolutionary. And he was amazing. And there was this big connection to Dr. Suzuki. And in 1985, it's only 1 year later, the conference was in Cork in Ireland. And George, by God, he brought Henry. Was Henry that first little boy? And there was who was that boy? Martha will remember his name. He's the black kid. He played great. Now, he was big enough to actually use a double bass, the smallest double bass they made, which I think was a quarter. Mm-hmm. But the little guy, was he called Henry? Was that George's first pupil? Which Henry were you talking about?
I was talking about Henry Perebrun, who's now in the Cleveland Orchestra. But I remember this discussion, and the name's escaping me too, but I remember George and Henry Perebrun talking about that first pupil. I can't remember his name either.
I've got a picture of him. He's in the background. It's Dr. Suzuki and me. We're in Cork. The cellos have just played, and Suzuki's giving me a big message, and they're all the cellists sitting there. But there's also there's this picture of this little boy there. Anyway, he was too small. We wanted him small, but and he was the smallest one we'd find, and so we just we put different kinds of strings. We tried electric, bass strings, everything. Put him on a cello. That was because we didn't have baby basses. And so they played for Suzuki. That was the first time George met Dr. Suzuki. And then when we came back to Washington after Ireland, we went to Manchester, and we met up again with Rodney and that lot. And that's when he met that, oh God, I wish it were better with names, that lovely French guy who made the instrument. Christian.
Oh, is it Labrie? Christian Labrie? Is that who?
Yeah,
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And we were just like, oh my God, this bass is so beautiful. This baby bass, it was just to die. And so we came back and George got one made in Washington. And so it was presented to, it was some bigwig was in town, Suzuki bigwig in Washington. And so they came to my house and we presented the bass. I've got a picture somewhere, God knows where. It wasn't even varnished yet, and we had a 5-year-old. Finally, we had a 5-year-old. And that was the beginning, George getting all these basses made and, oh my God, bows and strings and, yeah.
Upton Bass is at a fascinating transition from selling accessories online, kind of in the early days, to selling other people's basses, to starting to make their own basses, which they now do and make over 120 a year. Here are Eric and Gary of Upton Bass on that transition.
So then we stopped getting containers of instruments,
right? Yeah,
which was
a lot of dough all at once. So it was taxing, and the quality was going down with every shipment, And at that point, we were doing so much ourselves, anyways. Final assembly, varnish, setup. It was kind of a no-brainer to start making them in-house.
Whatever your playing needs are, Upton Bass will find you an instrument that works with your budget and that you will love for the long term. They have an amazing loyal fan base that has bought, several people have bought 2, 3, even 4 Upton Basses over the years. They stand behind their products. They're beautiful instruments made in the Northeast in the United States. UptonBass.com, and thanks so much for sponsoring the podcast. Buying an instrument or bow is a major decision, especially the first time a student's looking for an instrument. Here's A440 Violin Shop's Michael Spadero on what he advises.
We usually start with an approximate price range, and we'll show them anything within that price range, and then to give them a little bit of context, I'll often show them instruments that are more or less expensive than that. But I say to play as many instruments or bows as possible before you buy.
Whether you're looking for a new instrument or a new bow or that next step in your journey, A440 Violin Shop has got you covered. Look for them online at a440violinshop.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by the Bass Violin Shop, which opened in 2001 as a small double bass workshop in Greensboro, North Carolina. Today, they're staffed by 3 full-time, highly skilled bass luthiers, and they specialize in double bass sales, rentals, setup, restoration, and repair. For nearly 20 years, they have satisfied thousands of clients by offering quality instruments, knowledgeable service, reliable repairs, and superior restorations at affordable prices. Did you know that they regularly ship basses nationally from coast to coast? Contact their team to find out more information about the shipping process and how you can get your dream bass delivered to your doorstep. For more information and current inventory, visit their website at bassviolinshop.com and be sure to follow them on Facebook and Instagram. It's been interesting to me, and I've been teaching bass for 20 some odd years, 25 years maybe, and it's interesting even in these 25 years to watch this approach become, I would say, dominant in the United States at this point. I look around and most people that I see, seems to me at least, that most people are starting young bassists at the neck block if they're taking private lessons now here in the United States. And that was not the case, when I was back starting out, certainly, or even like when I started teaching. And it's just so interesting to me to watch that get adopted. Was that approach of starting at the neck block? I mean, did George come up with that? How can you just tell me about that? Yeah, tell me about that.
He came up with it because I said we have to find the easiest way to teach this instrument. And he said, well, then we're not going with the mandel. And when he showed me the mandel, I said, no, we have to do the opposite, George. This really won't work. The lowest strings, walking by steps, the lowest pitches. Oh my God. It was just like, I didn't like digging yourself out of from underground or something. And so, so that was it. And he said, well, here's where because I said, because I love harmonics and I use harmonics a lot in my teaching. And so and there was George. He said, how about this? And it was just brilliant. I mean, he really was, he was the brilliant guy. No doubt about it. And that was, And that's also because I spent a lot of time teaching in Australia. And I used to get visited by the double bass players. They were so sweet. They would come and find me wherever I was teaching. We're here about George and the bass, and oh my God, man, that's so cool. And they loved it. They
Wow.
they use it in Australia too. Yeah, that was for the easiest possible way to develop a sense of pitch and play melodies as opposed to bass lines on the double bass. So that's where we started.
Well, I remember the day I switched and started teaching my beginners with that approach, with Progressive Repertoire, short and bread. And I just remember, like, I felt like this load was lifted because I, like so many people, had been kind of muscling out those early Samandal exercises with our A flats in half position, our, all that kind of stuff. Essentially you're teaching them like an atonal exercise almost, versus fifths and sixths and thirds and just watching how natural that left hand position came to people at the neck block and then moving it down. I mean, it really is that it's brilliant in its simplicity but it really, I can't believe how transformative that was for me when I discovered that and started using that.
Well, I'm very, very happy to hear it. I mean, it just seemed the most natural thing in the world. And I couldn't believe that, it had taken all this time for people to come out of that basement, starting to teach in the basement, and coming up to the light. This is the way I looked at it. And things we carried on with all this stuff. I mean, we carried on, even though I eventually left. Well, I was only in Washington for 4 years. So that was pretty. Well, I met George in 84 and I left for Cairo. I moved to Cairo in 86, but I came back every summer. And of course, George and I were writing and all that stuff. And we were both trying to get things done, getting things published or something, just getting things moving, getting it out there. And of course the instruments were being made and everything. And then I'd come back every summer. Well, then I moved back from Cairo in 1990. I moved back to the States under duress. I ended up in Baltimore, which was not where I wanted to go, but there you go again.
Sure.
And now I don't know if it was Francois or it was Paul Ellison. One of the two, those two communicated and said something's happening in Washington with children and basses, and it's I can't remember which of the two. I think maybe it was Paul. Maybe Paul got wind of it. That's probably it. And he would, Paul Ellison, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so and Hal Robinson had just moved to principal bass of the National in Washington, and so Paul said, who of course knew him because he just come from that section, said, check this out. Something's happening there. We need to see what this guy's doing. Mm-hmm. And so Hal Robinson entered the scene and Francois, and then that whole party grouping. I mean, Francois and George and Martha and me. And I mean, yeah, we were attached at the hip actually, still are. Uh-huh. And so that's when all that's when we connected, and then Francois started coming, and then we were going to Paris, and George was bringing his students, and it just, it all just segued so beautifully because it was like, the Nouvelle Technique, and this was like the starter version.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
To get, it was just so connected. Mm-hmm. It was so connected. And That was wonderful.
That's a great way to look at it, as the starter version of that tech, and it's such a great entry point into that world. And the whole thing you were describing with harmonics and how you use them on the cello. That's something, another big takeaway for me, starting to incorporate this into my own teaching. Just how natural it seems to use those harmonics as the position points, as your landmarks. I mean, it's just the most natural thing in the world once you get used to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it takes you everywhere painlessly. You cannot wonder if you're in the right spot, because it sounds god awful if you're not.
Right.
And it rings if you are in the right spot. And it's the geography of the fingerboard, of the instrument, and it's just Lisa Liskey called it anchor positions. On the and that's exactly what they were on the bass. And the bass was always using harmonics to tune anyway.
Right.
So it's kind of a natural. But yeah, these are all the things that, we were by ourselves doing this stuff, and it was just like, I don't know, finding gold.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
This works. This would be easy.
This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Our friends at D'Addario want to help listeners change their strings safely and efficiently, and they have a few tricks to help you achieve that. Apply graphite, like pencil lead, to the bridge and nut, the contact points of the string, to ensure the strings slide smoothly on their way up to tension. This prevents them from getting stuck and unwinding or pulling the bridge so that it leans. Learn more at orchestral.daddario.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass, and I've always been impressed by how Steve manages to get basses sounding so vibrant, whether it's a student-level bass or a top-of-the-line professional bass. Here's Steve on some of what he has learned in terms of setup.
When steel strings came into general use around 1959, the German bass makers flipped out, and they really got scared that they're going to get big shiploads of basses back that got wrecked by these high-tension steel strings. And so they did three things that really changed the function of the instrument. They shortened the string length, and they lowered the neck angle so the bridges weren't that tall anymore. And then they made the tops a lot thicker. They really wanted to ensure that these basses were not going to come back across the ocean for work anymore. And so the basses tend to sound kind of nasal, and they didn't have any depth. They didn't have a chest voice at all, And so what we do with increasing the neck angle, and we can also increase the overstands for modern playing, can get up into thumb position a lot easier. So a neck reset can accomplish that. Sometimes we'll transplant a neck or make a new neck for these basses that might have a string length that are not friendly to modern playing.
Learn more about what Steve can do to get your bass playing better, and check out his great selection of basses at steveswanstringbass.com. And thanks for sponsoring the podcast, Steve. Well, and then the other gold, at least to me, the major discovery was how early thumb position is introduced. And that's something I remember the first time I looked in the book, the volume 1, Progressive Repertoire, I thought, really? Thumb position this quickly? But as I started to do it, I mean, talk about a great, because like you were saying, crawling up from the basement into seeing the light. I mean, thumb position was like this. It seemed to be such a scary thing to me when I was learning bass, and to other students, and like just incorporating it, using those harmonics and Scotland's Burning and putting down the one and the three fingers. I mean, was that something that George came up with, or how did that early introduction emerge?
Well, I had a whole series of exercises that my kids do every day. And it's just like any sportsman, any jock, they do their warm-ups to get ready for playing. And so they were all about going from the big motions to the small motions. And so it meant the whole cello, and then we go down, we narrow it down finally to, step-by-step progression in terms of notes, And so, I had these exercises, and they were, I have to say it. Okay, so the hand in thumb position, but writing between the strings the whole length of the fingerboard. That was one of the big ones. And so this was what we wanted to do with the bass, because it seemed, again, so natural and so easy.
Yeah. And
they can see what they're doing. It's right there in front of them. They can hear it. The pitch is higher. They've got the harmonics to help them. Mm-hmm. And if that, that it's developed, if they're balanced in their sitting when they're tiny, and then a little bit later standing, if they're balanced with their instruments, thank you again, Francois helped us so much with that, then it's easy. It's easy. It's easy for the ear. It's easy for the body. It's easy for the hand. And, when you need to go back down there, then that gets easier also. But it's not when you start.
Yeah.
So that's how, it was just it seemed logical to us.
And then mirroring those some of those early pieces, you teach it in first position, you teach it in Roboth's fourth position, kind of standard thumb position, and then getting into that, then going up into sixth position and that harmonic world. That's another. I love introducing that early, and I love seeing students' eyes light up when they realize, oh, I can do Scotland's Burning here. Third position by the neck. I can do Scotland's Burning, fourth position, thumb position, and I can do it in harmonics, or what I call like the world's most challenging twinkle, up in sixth position, because you got to do it on three strings. But students love doing that, and you can see them figuring it out, and that's another stroke of genius in my mind.
Well, I'm glad.
So thank you.
I'm glad. Well, it's my pleasure. It all it made sense to us. It was essentially, what made sense to us. We were trying it out. We were doing it all at the same time. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It was, there was no proof except that we believed that this was the easiest way to do things, and then the next step and the next step, and then George with his genius, making tunes, mm-hmm. finding the tunes or writing the tunes himself. There's a lot of those that he wrote a lot of those. That because it's in the book, but and then his students,
mm-hmm.
he'd look at him and say, "Is this working, guys? Are you, okay? If you try this, try that, And then having Francois come every summer, that was just such a blessing. And working with all the kids, and and making them just melt and faint and everything the way he played. It was just like, and he loved it so much, and it was just he was so joyful about it, and he was so giving, and he was so unrelentingly positive. Like, what was that famous? Stop telling me you can't and just do it. Or, shut up and just do it.
Right.
It was like,
right.
Yeah, just do it.
Yeah.
And so this, this was, we were trying to create, don't create a method, but develop a method of teaching to these kids where they could just go step by step, and they could just grab anything and
mm-hmm.
feel completely confident.
Mm-hmm. Well, and now what I love, and I've mentioned this a bunch of times on my show, but I've been chatting. I've done interviews with people. I brought her up a lot. So sorry, Nina DeCesar, but Nina DeCesar was one of George's early students, and she's playing in the Oregon Symphony here in the States. I think Ted Botsford, who's in the Los Angeles Philharmonic, right? So it's so
I love Ted.
Right? Isn't Ted great? And so it's great to see some of these people that have, I guess, come up, this way, starting bass young, and now starting to move into professional careers. We're kind of at that point in time where that's happening, and more, and it's so fascinating to me from my perspective, just to see this pedagogy spread, and more young people playing the bass. Another name we may both know her, Kate Jones, good friend of mine who teaches Suzuki bass in the Dallas area. I had the chance to go in and work with her students, and you walk in and you see, like, I don't know, 12, 15 elementary school age bassists all sitting on those little stools. With the little basses, and it's so cool to see what I remember seeing in Suzuki violin class when I was observing back at Northwestern. To see that in the bass world, it's really cool to see that take place.
You were at Northwestern?
I went to Northwestern. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you know Ed Kreitman?
He wasn't there. I know the name, but he wasn't there when I was there. But I learned James Chelland. Jim Chelland was the music. He was the music ed chair or whatever the word is when I was there. But I took a lot of pedagogy classes and got a chance to sit in on some of the Suzuki violin component of Northwestern. So very interesting.
Yeah, I'll bet. Yeah, well, I mean, if we had a list of all the kids that George has taught, I'm sure many of them are professionals now. And I mean, and Ted, he was great. Mm-hmm. He was, and his mother was so cool. I mean, his whole family was cool. And we just got recitals and concerts and stuff we did with them. It was terrific. It was terrific. Oh, did you ever go to any of George's summer bass things?
Sadly, I didn't. I got into all the, even though I was active and playing. I'm 42, so I certainly the age where I should have done that sort of thing, but it wasn't on my radar at that point. But I've talked to so many people, Johnny Hamill, and people who knew George and were so influenced by him. So I wish I could go back in time and do that. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean. I know exactly what. Yeah, it was pretty magical. It was very magical, actually. So I'm probably forgetting things I should be saying, but anyway.
No, I don't know. You've covered a lot. It's great. This is exactly what I was hoping we could just chat a bit. I mean, another something I love doing, like just. I'll by the time I put this out, we'll have put out that episode with George. But like, what was George like as a person? I mean, he's sort of somebody that bass players. He's somebody that I think bass teachers these days put up on a pedestal and think of as he's this sort of just one of our pedagogy founders. For our instrument. What was George like?
Oh, George. George was intense. George was intense. Nothing. He was intense about everything. Everything that he believed in, everything he did, he was intense about. It was baseball, or if it was bass, or if it was church music, because he was very active in his in the Orthodox Church, and he did lots and lots of music with the church and for the church, and writing things and conducting and playing and all this stuff. He was intense, and he was. There was a sweetness about George, along with the intensity, and he was highly intelligent, and I think he found it really quite difficult sometimes when he would be with adults, not with kids, because kids he knew were intelligent, but adults have been dumbed down, and so he would sit and listen a lot. He wouldn't talk a lot, and then he would just come out with something, and everybody would be going, "Oh, right, yeah, that's true, isn't it?" And it was like he could get to the core of whatever it was that you were discussing or trying to figure out, and he was always trying to be better. Always. He was, practicing and searching. He was always searching. And he was completely, almost without ego in that way. if Martha and I hadn't done, I'm not putting myself in the same place as Martha, because Martha was just the greatest support in the world. I wasn't married to George. We were the ones who would, we weren't the only ones, but George didn't push himself into the fore. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
He was in a way, he was retiring in that way. Now, it's George, we have to get this out there. We have to, and he would take a step back,
Mm-hmm.
and so he was a humble person, but he was intense. And he was incredibly hardworking.
Well, I'm glad the bass community thanks you for being there and pushing him into the forefront, because it's really it sounds like
been a revolution.
Yeah,
it's been a revolution, and that's what we wanted. We just said it's going to take a revolution,
Mm-hmm.
Rodney Slatford knew it, and George did it.
Yeah, yeah,
basically,
Absolutely. Annette, this is awesome. I thank you so much for chatting. I really appreciate it. If it's okay, I'll go through and edit this a little bit, put this out on the podcast, and just kind of people can kind of hear the backstory. George has come up. I think the most common topics of discussion over the 12 years have been George Vance, Paul Ellison, and Francois Rabath, and we've talked about all of them. So this is a successful episode for sure. Annette, thank you so much for chatting with me. Thank you to Martha Vance, George's widow, for connecting us and suggesting that we talk. And we put out recently an interview with Henry Perbrun of the Cleveland Orchestra and George Vance. So I really hope that you're enjoying this deep dive, I guess. I use that phrase way too often, but I guess that's what it is, into double bass pedagogy. Talking about George Wellington this month. We're talking about George Vance this month. And it's just really great to be a part of these conversations, be chatting with Annette and other people who've been associated with these great pedagogues. I learned so much, and I really hope that you are enjoying this as well. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. Mitch is making beautiful instruments and doing great bass work in the Dallas area, and you can learn more at mitchmooring.com. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.